I'm really sorry that I'm not there with you. I wasn't able to travel yesterday, so I hope that this video link will suffice. So my story is about the influence and impact of the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda. One morning in April 1994, I was waiting with a colleague in a hotel lobby in Brussels, and we were about to set off for a large ECHO-organised conference where we were going to launch a new publishing network for humanitarian workers, the predecessor of the Humanitarian Practice Network. As we were waiting for a taxi to take us and our boxes of publications to the venue, I noticed the headline dominating the newspapers on display. They said, 10 Belgian soldiers killed in Rwanda. The murder of these soldiers closely followed the shooting down of the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi, and it marked the start of the Rwandan genocide. During the following 3 months, an estimated 800,000 Rwandans were murdered. But at that moment, I had no idea of what was to come and the impact it would have on the people of Rwanda and the Great Lakes region and the humanitarian sector. In July 1994, just as the genocide was being brought to an end by the RPF advance, over 1 million refugees flooded across the border into eastern Zaire. Cholera then claimed the lives of some 30,000 people, and a further 50,000 or so died of dysentery in Rwanda and the refugee camps in Tanzania and Zaire. The head of evaluation in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Niels Stavelstein, invited heads of evaluation from other donor agencies to join Denmark in carrying out a collaborative evaluation of the international response. So what became the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda. ODI was awarded the contract to undertake Study 3, focusing on the humanitarian response, and I was appointed the team leader. The evaluation ran from January 1995 until March 1996, when the 4 separate studies, together with the synthesis report, were published. The joint evaluation was highly critical of the international community's political and military response to the genocide. One of the main findings was that official funding of humanitarian action in effect became a substitute for effective political and military action. Whilst the major failings clearly lay within the political and military domains, shortcomings in the humanitarian response were also apparent. In the Study 3 team, we were particularly critical of the coordination arrangements within the UN, the lack of preparation by key agencies ahead of the refugee influx into Goma, and the poor performance of some international NGOs that, frankly, simply weren't qualified to operate in such a context. The synthesis report contains 64 carefully crafted recommendations, with each one being addressed to a specific organisation or groups of organisations. To monitor how these recommendations were acted upon, we formed an 11-member monitoring group, the Joint Evaluation Follow-up Facility, or JEF, which I had the role of coordinating. By June 1997, so that's 15 months after publication of the joint evaluation, the JEF assessment was that just over 1/3 of the recommendations had been discussed, accepted and acted upon. And overall, 2/3 of the recommendations had been discussed and had at least some sort of positive outcome. But at this point, it was really difficult for us to discern a pattern in these results. However, in 2004, so that was 10 years after the genocide and 8 years after publication of the joint evaluation, John Eriksson, the team leader of the synthesis team, and myself were commissioned to prepare a comprehensive assessment of the joint evaluation's impact and influence. And it was by this point that a clearer picture had emerged. Our assessment showed that On the central issue of the prevention and suppression of genocide and massive human rights abuses, despite the interventions in Kosovo and Sierra Leone, only limited progress had been made by the international community. In Darfur, mass killings and ethnic cleansing were underway even as we prepared our assessment. However, there were a number of areas where the joint evaluation had had a positive influence and impact. Most notably, these were in relation to developments on accountability and standards and greater professionalism within the humanitarian sector. For instance, the Sphere project was conceived in late 1995 in part because some in the NGO community feared that the joint evaluation was going to recommend some form of external regulation of NGOs. To some extent, therefore, Sphere's origins may be seen as an attempt by the NGO community to develop a self-regulation mechanism as a way of heading off any calls for external regulation. And it worked. Awareness of Sphere's existence when we were preparing the final report allowed us to praise and encourage the initiative rather than come up with anything more interventionist. Another of our recommendations was that a humanitarian ombudsman mechanism should be established. Some saw this as a ridiculous idea, and I distinctly remember laughter in the room when I introduced this recommendation at a large meeting of NGOs in London. However, a year later, the British Red Cross initiated a cross-agency group to explore the recommendation, and this led to the Humanitarian Ombudsman project, which was led by John Mitchell, which in turn evolved into the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, so HAP, and then on to the current core humanitarian standard. And of course, another legacy of the joint evaluation was ALNAP itself. We felt that the Joint Evaluation Steering Committee, with its 38 members, there was nothing like this existed in the humanitarian sector at that time, something that brought together donors, UN, NGO, and Red Cross organizations. So a group of us developed the idea of a similarly composed forum focusing on learning and accountability. ALNAP was born, and the first biannual meeting held in London in May 1997. So the picture that had become clearer by 2004, that it was actually the humanitarian sector that had done most to respond to the recommendations of the joint evaluation. Of course, we didn't necessarily agree with all the changes that had taken place in the humanitarian sector over those years. Myself and many of my colleagues in the Study 3 team would far rather that NGOs hadn't been forced by donors to adopt the straitjacket of the log frame or become quite so dependent on donor funding with all that that implies. And of course, it wasn't until after the Darfur debacle in 2004 that the issue of coordination was finally addressed via the cluster system. I sometimes wonder how differently things might have turned out if some of our recommendations hadn't actually been rejected. So those that were rejected included one on merging the humanitarian functions of the various UN agencies into one organization. Another was a proposal we made that all funding for humanitarian actions be controlled by one organizationally neutral humanitarian funding agency. Unfortunately, those recommendations were rejected. Nevertheless, a satisfying way of concluding this story is to reflect that if it hadn't been for the joint evaluation, ALNAP probably wouldn't have been formed, and that this meeting in Stockholm celebrating ALNAP's 20th anniversary wouldn't be happening. I just wanted to share with you in ending this picture of a rug that was very kindly bought for me by ALNAP members when I stepped down from the ALNAP coordinator role in early 2002. It's a really treasured possession, and I want to thank all those that contributed to this wonderful gift. Thank you.
Like my mother, when she went to school, it was right after the war. The whole country was destroyed. And the biggest obstacle for the children to go to school was that they didn't have proper shoes or clothes to go to school, especially in the winter time. And luckily, UNICEF brought in loads and loads of clothes to Finns so that the children could go to school. And even my mother. And she then later came as a teacher.
Neuroscience research shows that violence and neglect scar the growing brain. The adversity and trauma experienced during wars and emergencies affect children's memory and their ability to reason, to solve problems, and to express themselves creatively and emotionally. In other words, it affects their ability to learn.